When my company announced the annual work retreat, I honestly didn't want to go. These events always felt exhausting. Fake laughter, forced networking, and coworkers pretending office politics somehow counted as friendship. But this year was different because spouses were invited. My husband, Ethan, encouraged me to go. "It matters to your career," he said with that calm support he always carried. Ethan was never flashy or loud. He worked as an architect, preferred quiet weekends, and somehow always made stressful things feel manageable without trying too hard. Still, I worried about bringing him around my coworkers. Not because of him, but because of my boss, Richard. Richard had a habit of making jokes at other people's expense, especially toward anyone he considered less impressive. I quietly hoped Ethan would stay unnoticed enough to avoid becoming a target. The retreat took place at a luxury lakeside resort 2 hours outside the city. Everyone dressed slightly nicer than necessary, smiling too hard while pretending team-building activities were somehow fun. Ethan handled it better than I expected. He stayed polite, asked thoughtful questions, and somehow made awkward conversations feel comfortable. Several co-workers actually liked him immediately. Even my friend Melissa quietly whispered, "Your husband seems way nicer than half the guys here." I smiled because she was right. Ethan had this calm confidence that didn't demand attention. Unfortunately, people like Richard noticed quiet confidence too, especially when it didn't revolve around impressing him. The tension started during dinner on the second night. Everyone sat around long tables overlooking the lake while drinks loosened conversations into louder jokes and exaggerated stories. Richard stood near the center, holding court like always. Eventually, the topic shifted toward careers and ambition. Someone asked Ethan what he did for work. "I'm an architect," he said simply. Richard laughed lightly. "Ah," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "So you're one of those guys who spends months arguing over windows and paint colors?" A few people laughed awkwardly. Ethan smiled politely. "Something like that," he replied calmly. I felt uncomfortable immediately but hoped it would stop there. It didn't stop. Richard seemed entertained by the attention. "Must be nice," he continued, grinning. "Your wife's the ambitious one while you make houses look pretty." More laughter followed, thinner this time. My stomach tightened. Ethan stayed calm, taking a sip of water like none of it bothered him. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself now. "Honestly," he added casually, "behind every successful woman is a husband just trying not to get left behind." The table went quieter. Even co-workers started shifting awkwardly. I wanted to say something, but embarrassment froze me in place. Then Richard laughed again and looked directly at me. "So tell us," he joked, "does Ethan ever get insecure knowing you probably make bigger decisions than he does?" A few nervous chuckles followed. My face burned instantly. I glanced toward Ethan expecting discomfort, or maybe frustration. Instead, he simply set his glass down calmly and folded his hands together. No anger. No awkward smile. Just stillness. Somehow, that quietness changed the energy around the table immediately. Richard still looked amused, waiting for a reaction. What he didn't realize was Ethan almost never spoke quickly. But when he did, people listened. Ethan smiled politely and looked at Richard calmly. "Actually," he said softly, "I've always found something interesting about confidence." The room quieted without anyone meaning it to. Even nearby conversations seemed softer suddenly. Richard smirked slightly. "Oh yeah." Ethan nodded once. "Real confidence usually doesn't need an audience," he replied evenly. Silence. Real silence. The kind that arrives unexpectedly and doesn't know where to go. Richard laughed awkwardly at first, trying to recover. "Come on, we're just joking around," he said quickly. But Ethan wasn't finished. "I'm sure," Ethan replied calmly. "But I've noticed something over the years." He paused briefly, still perfectly composed. "People who feel secure usually build others up. People who constantly make someone else smaller." He shrugged lightly. "Well, sometimes that says more than they mean it to." Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Even Richard's smile disappeared slightly. The table suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. A coworker quietly looked down at their plate. Someone else awkwardly reached for a drink. No one defended Richard. Somehow, Ethan had responded without insulting him once, and that made it land harder. Richard cleared his throat awkwardly and forced a laugh. "Didn't realize we were getting philosophical tonight," he muttered. Ethan smiled slightly. "Neither did I," he replied politely. "But respect feels like a good place to start at company events." That sentence finished the room. Completely. Earlier laughter vanished like it had never existed. For the first time since I'd worked there, Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not angry. Embarrassed. Publicly embarrassed. Because suddenly, everyone had quietly realized what had actually happened. Richard hadn't looked powerful. He had looked small. Later that night, several co-workers quietly approached Ethan. One even said, "I wish someone had said that to him years ago." Melissa laughed softly and whispered to me, "Your husband just professionally destroyed your boss without raising his voice." I should have felt embarrassed. Instead, I felt strangely proud. Because Ethan hadn't humiliated anyone. He simply refused to shrink himself so someone else could feel bigger. Watching him stay calm while protecting both himself and me changed something in me that night. The next morning, Richard barely looked Ethan in the eye during breakfast. Surprisingly, he also treated everyone a little differently afterward. Less mocking, less loud, less eager to dominate every conversation. Maybe embarrassment teaches lessons ego never will. On the drive home, I finally looked at Ethan and laughed softly. "You realize you completely shut down my boss, right?" He smiled without looking away from the road. "I wasn't trying to embarrass him," he said calmly. "I just think respect matters. And honestly, that quiet confidence left a bigger impression on everyone than any public argument ever could have."